Okay, let's go ahead and we will get started. I just want to welcome you to this iteration, this next episode of our Mucker Growth webinars. Today, we're going to be discussing company culture and how to scale without losing your soul. And just a couple of housekeeping items really quickly before we get started. We are going to post this recording on our blog. Once it's up, I will announce it in our Blue Collar VC newsletter. So be looking for that, and also make sure to sign up so that you are receiving the newsletter. We are having a little issues with the chat box, so go ahead and put things in Q&A. We will reserve some time at the end for Q&A, but also if you have questions as we're going along, feel free to drop them in there and we will try to get to those. And so without further ado, welcome. My name is Brittain Skinner. I run platform here at Mucker Capital, and I'm very excited to have our guest speaker today, Todd Emaus. Todd is a serial founder and also is a Mucker founder from way back in the day. And we are excited to hear what he has to say about scaling culture, some practices, and some tactical things that he has learned in his journey. And so without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Todd. Welcome, Todd.
Great. Thanks, Brittain. I appreciate it. Thank you for having me. Yeah, a bit more about me. As Brittain mentioned, I'm a serial founder. Our company entered the first MuckerLab class as an education startup. We had a pivot while we were in the program. I think Will Sue almost had a heart attack with how kind of clueless we were for a couple of weeks there. That company later rebranded to 2020 and was acquired by Envato a few years back. Ran a few companies before that as well. Since then, I've really been working as a coach and a consultant with a firm called Evolution, really focused on helping scaling startups through the kind of growth challenges that come up, especially on the people side of business, helping leaders develop capacity. And in all that work, a thing that continually comes up is this conversation around culture, an area where there's not a lot of clarity, not really clear exactly what to do. In this last couple months back, published a book called Scale Without Losing Your Soul that if you're here at the end, I'll give you some instructions on how to get a free copy on, but really trying to be like an actionable, like clear guide to how to go about building culture in a company that's growing quickly. Enough about me. I'd love to hear a little bit and just like get to feel like who's here, who's in the room with us. I saw some comments already in the Q&A, and we'll just use the raise hand functionality, I think. So just like to know what topics to spend a little more time on, it's helpful to have a sense of like who's in the room here today. So if you are a founder of a current business, can you raise your hand just for a moment, just so I can see how many founders we have in the room? Brittain, I don't know where I see the raise hands. Do you see them?
Yes, if you look under participants and attendees, it looks like we have 9 founders so far.
Perfect. Okay, and then go ahead and put your hands down. I'm curious also if you work at a company that has a published culture code, a set of core values, some articulation, some way that you've written down the kind of culture that you're looking to build. Would you raise your hand just to get a feel for who kind of already has some way of writing down the kind of culture that they're building? See one hand. Great. All right. Thanks, Sean. Go ahead and put your hand down, and let's just get a feel for size of companies represented here. And this first one we'll see. Does anybody here from a company with that a larger organization, like 500 plus people? Raise your hand just so I can get a sense of who's here from the larger organization.
Not seeing anyone.
So how about between like 100 and 500? Like you're already like have started to scale. People are showing up. Have a decent size team at this point. Got it. Okay, smaller teams. How about between 40 and 100? 40 and 100 employees or people on your team. Okay, don't see any hands there either. All right, so we got smaller teams. This is good. This is kind of my sweet spot, and I think exactly where we'll spend most of our time. Really helps me. Between 10 and 40 people, like you've started to build some sizable team, still probably pretty close knit.
I'm just seeing one.
One hand. All right, and so everyone here's got teams of size 10 or fewer hands up, just to make sure. Yeah, okay, smaller teams, great, super helpful. Thank you for that. So what we're going to cover today, we're going to cover 4 things. First, I'm going to cover we're going to walk through the 4 most common mistakes that I see leaders make regarding culture. This is especially tailored toward more early stage startups. So this is really helpful just to know that that's who's in the room. That was my sense of who would show up and wanted to just check. I'm going to give you like specifically how to overcome those obstacles. So you have some action plans. I'm going to help you identify your one next action. So you leave here with a thing to go and do or to start paying more attention to. And then I'm hoping we'll have plenty of time for Q&A at the end. As part of this webinar, we have a chance to make our own little microculture here together. And I don't want to spend too much time on this because I want to get to the material, but there's 2 agreements that I'm going to propose for our culture here today. The first one is confidentiality and what others share. So if there's a question that someone brings that is really specific to their business, I want those questions to be able to be here. And I'd like you just to hold that as confidential. You can take whatever content I bring to bear, and you're welcome to share that in any way. And the second one I'm going to propose is that you bring your experience. This can be good, bad, even ugly. This is a chance for us to learn together. I'd love any examples from your company that you want to ask in the Q&A. If you're confused at any point or you have a question in the moment, please do raise your hand. I want your full experience in the moment of what's happening. And just to make sure that we're feeling good with those 2 agreements, could I just see some raise of hands to say like, yeah, I'm good with that. I'm good with this kind of microculture that we're going to spend some time together today. Most of the hands up. Cool. If you have any questions on that, feel free to pop them in the Q&A, but let's dive in. All right, mistake number 1. The first mistake that I see most leaders, founders making around culture is this idea of like, I think of just culture reductionism. We start to like narrow down what we think of when we mean culture into just a small set of things. And usually they're the most observable, most doable sort of things. And I don't want to say that these things are bad. There's just a lot more in the menu. Usually this looks like something like culture becomes perks and culture becomes some kind of nice story that we tell. And it becomes some colorful t-shirt, or we've got this like kind of like interesting swag of some sort. When you're in an interview with a candidate and they ask what the culture's like, you know, perks and a nice story and a shirt are fine, but they're not really compelling answers. Anybody can copy this. And so we started to take company culture and make it about a few small little things. And I think in particular, this just becomes a path to mediocrity. It's easy to copy. I see culture as, for every business, is either a headwind or a tailwind for your business. And competing on perks and competing on a nice story just becomes this endless headwind. You have to keep up with other companies doing, offering new things, trying to be this like cool place to work. And essentially you're just trying to convince people over and over again why you're special and unique. This happens for 2 reasons. And yeah, this happens for 2 reasons. The first one is what I call the leader's culture building dilemma. So if you're a founder or a leader of a early stage startup, you've got a ton on your plate. It's really hard for culture to ever be the number 1 priority. And I think it almost never is the number 1 priority. And when there's other things to do, you're in this perpetual dilemma. Is now the time to spend and invest in culture? And I think the answer for most people tends to be no, now's not the time. I'll do it in the future. And it just becomes this thing that gets deferred and deferred and deferred. My sense is you're already overcoming this just by being here at this webinar. You're taking some time to make this a priority, and I acknowledge you for that. The second reason this happens, and this is a trap that I fell into, is I just had no idea what to do. There's a lot of work to be done. There's people to hire. There's a business to scale. There's fundraising to do, on and on and on. I can keep naming all the things. And even if you've got like an hour to spend on culture, it's not clear how I can actually make that hour impactful right now. There's a lot of material out there on the side of the philosophical side of culture, and it gives you like these ideas of what it might look like, but there's not really a whole lot of clarity on what exactly to do. And so this is why my colleague and I wrote Scale Without Losing Your Soul. We built this kind of like 6-phase model called the Culture Building Roadmap. We're going to touch on a few parts of this today. I'm not going to walk you through it all. You're going to get a free copy of the book. If you want to really check it out and dive deep, go for it. What I really wanted to do with this book and with this model is give a clear framework for how you can think about methodically building culture at an organization that is full of sort of action and doing instead of like thinking and wondering. So we'll touch on some of this in particular as you look at the other mistakes that happen. The second mistake I see happen is this idea of like borrowed culture. When I was leading my last business, I believed in the potential of culture. I knew it was something I really wanted to build, like a unique company that brought the best out of my people. And I had no idea what to do. So with almost everything where I had a question like this, I go and do some research. I started to look around on what other companies do. And what do other companies do, or at least what can you find out there? You'll find all kinds of blogs and articles and things about company core values and examples of company culture decks. And I started just digging through these and I started finding things, oh, that's kind of interesting and that resonates. And I started to like piece some of these things together into what I thought sounded like a good culture. And really, I was just borrowing a bunch of ideas, and borrowed culture just doesn't work. There's an example of this that happened in a company that I know of, where a senior executive was hired from Netflix to come into this early stage startup to help them start to like scale their company. This company hadn't articulated their culture in any way yet. And so the senior exec showed up and said, hey, why don't we just use Netflix culture? And just took their culture deck and said, like, let's just start using this as ours. And it didn't work well. It didn't work well for that hire because it wasn't theirs. It wasn't who they were, even if some of the ideas are compelling. And so the alternative to this is to really take some time to discover your essence. And this is built on a belief that your company has an essence or a soul, or if that sounds too spiritual, then a DNA. There's something that is unique to you. There's a unique way that you do business. If you're inside the Mucker ecosystem, you've met other founders of other companies. And while you're all trying to build a business, you probably can feel into like, there's different ways we see things. There's different things that are important to us. And discovering your essence is really the starting point to me, for any culture building activities, like really understanding who are we, what is our identity, what makes us unique. And when you are in this phase, what you're doing is you're trying to unearth or trying to like dig up these, like, this is so us behaviors. Like someone would be like, oh, that's so us if we do that thing. I'll give you a couple examples in a few moments. How you do this is you play the role of like anthropologist. You're like looking at this, civilization or group of people and trying to like deeply understand them through like curiosity. How you do this is through interviews or focus groups. We've got a lot of teams that are like of 10 or smaller. A lot of times it's just like noticing what's happening around the table or what's happening in the Zoom meetings. You don't need to go into focus groups when you're that size. You just need to like be asking some of these questions. When are we at our best? One that I love, if we could clone if our company, if we could clone them, if we could just start to replicate this person, would like rapidly propel us forward. At our last company, was a guy named Aaron. And he was like, wow, well, what's so special about Aaron? He works really hard. He's really honest about things. He's super nice. And it's like, if we could have more Aarons here, we'd be able to grow fast. And what's different about working here? This one's especially useful to ask people who are new to your company. So they've just gone through an interview process. They've met a bunch of companies, and they chose to work with you. And so what's different about us? What things are you feeling into? And you'll get a bunch of material from this. With this material, you'll start to see themes emerge. This is a screenshot from an exercise I did with a company where I ran the focus groups and interviews, and start to see these themes emerge of like who they are. And then from there, you have the raw material to design a culture code or some articulation of who you are and the culture you intend to build. I don't care about the phrase culture code. You can call it a blueprint, but I think blueprint's useful. Like, this is the blueprint of the company you're trying to build. What's most useful about this is you're creating a single source of truth, like one thing that you can always go back to that articulates what you stand for, the behaviors that matter most, and facilitates all those conversations. And I'll show you how to use this as you go forward. A few examples of this: Magic Spoon's a protein-based cereal company that I've done some work with, and this is the culture code that we built. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time like going through all this. Hold on to the dream. I'll just call out as one of the ones that was really at the surface. This idea of like, hey, we really don't want adult life or work to be boring. We want this to be something that's fun. We want this to be like building like a world-class company and having a great time doing it together. People talked about like, it feels like we're just a bunch of buds. It's just a bunch of friends that come to work together every day. They got this other idea of being a Fruit Loop in a world of Cheerios. They want you to like bring your whole self. They don't want you to like just be some bland thing that comes in. They want you to show up as who you are. As an example, that in their onboarding, and we'll talk about how to embed your culture in your processes over time. But like in their onboarding, one of the questions they asked everyone was, what's your favorite treats? And on everyone's birthday, their favorite treats show up at their door or at the office, depending on where they're at. And like, they're going to get their thing for whatever it is that they like and most appreciate. And it's just a little thing, a little action, but it's like, as soon as you show up, we're going to find out what's important to you, what kind of thing you like, and you're going to get that. Cricket Health's another company that's I did a culture project for. Here's their culture values, just to give you an idea. The story I want to tell about Cricket Health in particular, their executive team, as they showed up to build these, kind of led into this with a whole bunch of skepticism around like, is this a good use of our time? Like, we're going to spend all this time in a room. There's a bunch of work to do. We're going to come up with some like nice statements. And is it going to actually matter? And I especially remember one of the executives leaving, mentioning that this is the most impactful work experience they'd have in their entire life, was to be with their peers, with their colleagues and their executive team, and get really clear on what mattered most to them and how they were going to start acting and behaving together. It was transformational for them. It became like a real inflection point for their business by defining their culture. They did this when they were about 15 to 20 people. I don't remember the exact size. They did this over the course of a 2-day offsite and then a series of meetings afterwards, and really transformational for them. The last one, his name is the DaVita Way. DaVita is a massive kidney dialysis organization. They have like over 2,000 centers at this point. I put this one up because they call this the DaVita Way. There's no mention of values. They do say live the values. They don't call this their core values. They don't call this their culture code. This is the DaVita Way. And it's like, however you name this articulation, that also is a part of your culture. Like, find what works for you. What does it mean to be, I don't know, what does it mean to be a Cardano or Sidespin Ventures or Gear Garage or Set Me Up Group, as a couple of the companies are here? Like, what's the Gear Garage way, or whatever feels like the right name for you? The first of our next actions. So if your team hasn't articulated your culture in any way, which most people raised their hand, and most people didn't raise their hand when I asked that question, this is the next action for you. This is where you should spend some time leaving this webinar today. And so how to do that? You can go and start to kick off an entire project to start to build your culture code. And that is a large piece of work. And I don't want to make it seem like it's some simple thing. So that may be where you're headed. Where you should start is by starting to gather the material for the culture code and just start to pay attention to, when are we at our best? Who are the people that if we could clone would really help us move forward? What are the behaviors? What are the ways of being that work for them? And just start to capture this. If you use Notion, just make a Notion database where you just start to throw these stories. If you don't use Notion, make a Google Doc. Just start to put the things that you notice in there. If you're a founder of the business, it's worth doing some of your own inquiry too, of like what it is that is important to you about building this business. The culture, especially in the early days, will always flow from the founders. And so spend some time with that. I don't think there is any time where it's too early to be doing this, which is starting to capture. I do think there are times when it is too early to start building your culture code, especially if you're trying to like build a traction story to do a first fundraise. I tend to think the time to do a full articulation of your culture is right after a fundraise. We've got some capital. We've got a plan to start hiring some people. You've got a bunch of things to do. So you're still going to be in that culture building dilemma, like, is now the time? But that's the time to me to say, like, let's actually get clear on what this looks like so that we can hire the right people, so that we can onboard those people into our culture, and so that they can really perform at their best. I've talked a lot already, so I want to pause here just on this idea of discovering your essence and designing your culture code. I'm curious what questions there are in the group that are important for us to answer. Anything that I shared that wasn't clear or confusing, or what's true for you and your organization?
And just a reminder to put those in the Q&A box, since the chat is not working. Are there any specific pieces of advice that you would give to single founders?
I think the first question I have is, are you still a single founder right now? Like, are you a solopreneur currently and there's no team? And I'll answer both paths. So one is, if you're a single founder and you have a team. One is, you're a single founder, you're solopreneur right now, just running the show by yourself. If you're by yourself, I do think there is tremendous value in having your own personal values and knowing like how you intend to live your life. And I think there's tremendous value in looking at how that overlaps with work. And I do think, great, yes, the team will grow to 10 and 12 months. Perfect. I think it's worth starting to think about, like, when are you at your best and what are the people that like most support you? So questions that you might look at there: what teams have you worked on, Ahmed, that have really brought the best out of you? And what is it that brought you alive? And start to look at that. What are the types of people that are going to perform at the highest level alongside you? I still think it's worth you capturing and having a place where you put down those things. And this just looks like I had a really productive day today. And like, what was it that enabled me to be so productive today? It's like, I don't know, maybe I was like really like having focused time and like really being in a pattern of like continual learning is really important to me, and just capture that and just start to build a repository of what it is that brings out the best in you and your organization, even if your organization's one right now. Any other questions on essence or designing a culture code? And there'll be time at the end too to jump back in.
Not seeing anything right now.
Then onward we go. All right, mistake number 3. Mistake number 3 is when the leaders don't actually live their culture. This is bullshit culture. We've named some things, we've written down some things, we've listed some core values, and we don't actually live them. In particular, the leaders don't actually live them. Darcy, I see your question. How do you implement a cultural code? I'm going to chat about that in just a few minutes. I'll show you how to like bring that to life, and we can revisit that question if it doesn't feel like I cover that well. The leaders that don't live their culture code, when this bullshit culture is, usually it's the case that you've named something that sounds nice, but it's not actually true for you. It turns your values into like a source of skepticism for your employees. We say this, we don't really mean it. I imagine some of us have worked at places like this. I know I have. A few examples of this. Enron is one of the, it's been a while now, but one of the biggest fraud cases in the history of all business, and integrity was their #1 listed core value. More recently, Away, the luggage company, had quite a bit of press in their workplace, and they had a number of kind of not so thoughtful, or their core values are kind of in the shade back there. Shoot, stated values: thoughtful, customer obsessed, iterative, empowering, accessible, and in it together. And they had a number of like kind of things that kind of came out that showed it wasn't really that empowering of a place, and maybe not that thoughtful, and definitely not so in it together. And I'm not here to throw shade at Away. I don't think like these are the kind of the more public examples that play out of when we say something, we say we stand for something, but we don't actually behave in that way. And but this is happening in much more subtle ways in organizations all the time. The way to overcome this and get around this mistake is to really prototype with your culture code. So Darcy, this will start to answer some of your questions. For any idea to spread, you need to have like a critical mass of people behaving in some certain way. If you've ever been in a room of people before, if a bunch of people start doing a thing, you start doing the same thing. Like there's a way of like tribalism of like how we want to be accepted. And we just like start to move into patterns and say, hey, this is what's normal and accepted here. It's starting to create a norm. I suggest every team does this. So if you articulate your culture code, you name like, hey, here's what we stand for. Before you roll that out, which most companies just like print those words on posters and start slapping them up everywhere and hope everything changes. Before you do that, put it to the test. You just run a live controlled experiment inside your team. And if this is the case for you, if you have something where the leaders aren't living it yet, you're not 100% confident that your culture code's true of you, here's how you do it. You just get your leadership team together. You talk about now that you've named your behaviors, you've named like the things that are important to you, which of these are most edgy for us? Which ones are we not sure about? And you just commit to practicing them. Usually I put this in a cycle of like 2 to 4 weeks. Can be just like two meetings from now or something like that. We're going to get back together and we're going to talk about how this went. And in the meantime, you're going to give each other feedback live in the moment as you go. That can be via Slack. It can be at the weekly meeting. It doesn't really matter, but you're taking some way of being that you're naming is important to you and actually putting it to the test before you roll out to the organization. I believe that one of the core jobs of a founder is to reduce risk in the organization, and naming your beliefs and not actually living them is a source of risk. And so what you're doing here is you're de-risking your culture code, and in many ways starting to create concentration around the behaviors so that people are starting to see these things happen before they even maybe hear about what's happening.
Todd, we've got a question related to that.
Yeah.
So one of our attendees says that they've heard a lot of people complain about companies and bosses that push values on them, but the employees just want a nice environment with good pay, and they're tired of getting all of the corporate values and the culture code and, you know, all of those things that maybe 20 or 30 years ago might have worked, but are they still effective?
Got it. Well, I'll share some of my beliefs on this, and I don't know if everyone believes these, but I believe that human beings desire deeper meaning and purpose in their life. And I believe that for better or worse, a lot of the workplace has gotten some of this in it. And so people want to show up for things that are more meaningful than just pay and more meaningful than just a nice environment. And usually the companies that like have people showing up in that way just have missed the mark and actually creating some broader context other than this is a place to get a paycheck and then you can go back to living your life. I believe it's possible for companies to build places that bring the best out of humans, and possible for companies to build places where people do the best work of their life and work that is deeply meaningful and deeply a part of their life. That's very easy to say, and I do think it's very challenging to do. But the way that you do that is by naming what's actually true, what you actually value, or what actual behaviors matter most, and then living them and starting to bring other people who are aligned with those ideas together to coexist and start to build something. I get the skepticism. Like I've seen the leaders that like don't actually live them, and then they're cracking the whip and saying like you need to obey these behaviors. But I think that's the breaking point is if an employee is being asked to do a thing that other people aren't doing, that feels really icky, of course. Then it feels like values are being used as a control mechanism instead of a meaningful, rich context in which to operate together. Culture should be the fabric that stitches you together, not some punitive tool. And I think that's usually what's happened in those cases. It's starting to become like, hey, you're not behaving in this way, bad. Neither is the leader in that case. Mistake number 4. This is usually when culture gets relegated to the background. So this is a company's like articulate and name their values. The leaders will start to behave in them, and then it sort of just like fades away over time. Like it feels like, hey, we have some values. I know they're written down somewhere. They're on a Notion page or they're on a wiki, and I see the words every now and then, but I'm not really seeing a whole lot of action. I don't see a whole lot of aliveness around them. There's not an ongoing conversation. This happens when culture is treated as a series of one-off projects. And the shift here is to start to treat culture as your second product. This is an idea that came from the guys that founded Asana a while back. And treating culture as product means continual iteration. It means that you're moving into this kind of build, measure, learn loop where you're all the time tending to this and seeing this as something that's being built over time instead of an arrival point. Your culture code isn't like, hey, there's our culture, we're done. That is only, again, the blueprint. It is the way that we evaluate. It's like, are we doing what we say we intend to do? And building, let's kind of work through the loop. So build is about embedding the culture into the work you're doing. And Darcy, this will start to answer some of your other questions, like how do you implement the culture code? You start to build your values or your core principles into the work. There's a bunch of places this can be, but the core ones look at people processes, so hiring. And in particular, this creates like, if you've named what matters to you, you have a hiring rubric that's almost for free. And most companies don't do that. You should just evaluate every single candidate that you meet against your cultural values or the things that matter most to you. You should talk about those in the process of discussing candidates. You should even surface them in the conversation with the interviews that you have. In onboarding, similarly, you want people to be touching into the values. You want them to experience it. You want them to hear stories of how you arrived at these. You want them to feel like this is the things that were told to me of what this culture is like in the interview process are actually happening. I'm seeing those right away. The other one that most people miss is performance conversations. Most performance management continues to be about only the outcomes of the business. Just take your performance conversations and make them about the outcomes of the business and how well you're living the values, or some kind of piece around like which of these values are most alive for you, which of these values like could we amplify more. Your meetings, anytime you gather as a place to look at like culture, the company that I work in today at Evolution, every single one of our meetings starts with a personal check-in, just like a minute for each person, just to share like how they are, how they're showing up. And that's a part of like how we care for each other. It's a really effective use of 10 minutes at the start of a meeting for us because of the culture we have, and other companies that would feel very strange to do. And then Slack and comms, like anything there, for sure, a place to look to embed culture. I'll give you a very specific example that I love in just a few minutes. Moving through this cycle, measure. If you want to measure your culture, pulse surveys are a really useful way to do this. There's a few different tools out there, Culture Amp and Lattice. I think they're really no-brainer sort of things just to like have some way of getting feedback and seeing what it's like for other people. Culture OKRs, this is missed by almost every organization. Almost no one makes culture actually strategic and brings it into their strategic planning. And so I just looked at like, is there a way that you can at least experiment with trying an OKR oriented toward culture? And if that works, can you have a culture OKR kind of on the regular for a way that you're tending to like your second product? And the last one, it's easy to say, but like every single conversation is a chance to build and measure culture. And so just don't miss out on the opportunities to like check in with people and understand like how some of this is playing out. Learning things to do here. If you're going to treat your culture as your second product, you want to have a product manager. So there should be one PM, one person that's accountable for this effort. In the early days, this is one of the founders. Later on, it ideally still is one of the founders just because they're going to care the most, but one person that's like ultimately accountable for the culture. And you want that one person to have some support, some cross-functional team. I know we're mostly groups of 10 or fewer employees. It's probably too early for cross-functional teams. It's probably worth having the whole company thinking about this in like the learn phase right now. If you're starting to get there, like how are we performing together? What things like are going really well? What are the things that aren't going very well? And just having conversations, like just a meta view on the work that you're doing can really help there. That Slack experiment I mentioned. So I think a key with treating your culture as your second product, you want to be in a place of running experiments, and you don't need to like have the answers. So just try. You can try things and hold them loosely and see what happens. Slack has this tool called the React-G channeler. Basically, if you click certain emojis, you can set up emojis to route when someone clicks it. In this case, the picture there with Tina Chen, if someone clicks the high fives, it will route that message to a channel called kudos, is what they're showing there. The emojis on the right here, a team that I worked with built custom emojis for each of their core values: candor, curiosity, forward action, learning, play, respect, simplicity. And then the employees, anytime they saw an example of play or an example of learning, they could click the little brain light bulb icon on that piece in Slack, and it would route to a learning channel. And sort of they built this repository of all the ways and could celebrate the learning that was happening in the org, which is may or may not work. I find it compelling. Whether it works for your org or not, I don't know. But yes, I see some questions queuing up. We'll get to those in just a second. And this one probably doesn't apply to the room just based on hands earlier. But if your culture code is dialed in, you feel like it's like set up, but it's a little bit too in the background, this is a place where you're moving into this mode of iteration. Again, assigning one person to be accountable for culture, some cross-functional culture team that's starting to identify the gap, like we're here and this is how we want it to be, experiments to find the way through. And it's worth considering, if you're in this place, like some sort of a reset at an all hands. There's this thing that happens for most founders where they feel like they need to have everything figured out and need to have their culture figured out and know it. And I encourage you to set that belief down and instead be in a place of, we're going to be a learning organization. We're going to stand for some things. We're going to get it wrong sometimes, and we're going to keep talking about those. And so some sort of all hands, just a reset around that can be really helpful to take some of the pressure off some of this work. A summary of next actions. For most of you, you haven't defined your culture yet. This is a place, just start discovering your essence. What is the essential nature of our organization? What is our DNA? What is it that makes us up, makes us work and work at our best? Just start capturing that, and you don't need to do anything else right now. Just have a place that you can put those things and start to let the themes start to emerge. And at some point, you're going to have the material ready to start to design something that feels right for you and your team. If your culture code's not fully aligned with your actual behaviors, this is where you're going to prototype in your leadership team. If your culture isn't alive in the day-to-day, this is where you want to start treating it like product and move into like a mode of iteration. And from there, we'll turn toward questions. I see a couple that have come in. Brittain, would you read those out?
Sure. We've got one. Adam is asking, do you have any advice on approaches or techniques to effectively build culture with remote teams?
Yeah, remote teams. Okay, so when I think of culture, I do think of like the fabric that keeps us connected. And what creates connection between people are two things in particular. One are shared values, and this is the power of articulating some culture code or naming your values. Like these are the things that hold us together in our values. And the other one is shared experiences. And so with remote in particular, what we lose are some of the shared experiences, or it feels like we lose them. We don't bump into people as much, going into the lunchroom or things like that. And so I think one piece is, I think it makes the need to be clear on our values and start that conversation more important. I think it's more important to start to have that as some way to connect you. And I think that's become clear in the past a couple of years as we've been moving more and more remote. A lot of companies haven't named what it is that stitches us together and how we're committed to behaving. And it's been hard and it's felt like isolating. The other thing is, how can you look at creating more shared experiences? And so the tools and the mechanisms have maybe changed, but I would lean into those So Slack or whatever communication tool that you use like that idea of a reaction channeler, I think anything there of like ways that you can start to stitch things together and like be really intentional at the design of your channels and how you engage is useful. I've been working with a team that's fully remote from even before the pandemic, and like they just have a series of rituals that they have that really support them. And so I'd move into like, how do we experiment with that? What they do, they have things called hangs that are meetings where there's no defined outcome or objective. It's more of like, I wouldn't say they're brainstorms. It's kind of like, let's just let whatever emerges in this group emerge in a conversation. It's almost as if a handful of people bumped into each other in the lunchroom and then just stayed there for 30 minutes. They just create a space where that can happen. The other thing that they do is they do in-person gatherings twice a year. That team is about 100 people today, and it is expensive perhaps to get everyone together, but it's much cheaper than having offices. And at least for them, it is much more meaningful to have this gathering. There is this anticipation and energy and excitement to be together. There's these people you've been working with for a handful of months that you get to meet for the first time, and it feels like really special to be together. I am bullish on remote, but it is a context switch. The thing that the analogy I use often is like, if you've ever gone to a summer camp, you go for a week and like you're with people for a week and you feel like these are like some of the people you know the best and trust the most in the world. And that's kind of the flavor that we've lost with remote. And so how do you make more of that? Like, how do you build a sense of togetherness and connection and trust without needing to be in person?
Todd, I would add, prior to Mucker, I worked for a fully remote team across a couple of countries, and it was small enough, but at the beginning of each of our full team meetings, we would have a couple of minutes where one or two people could share something of an interest or a personal thing that they were doing. They would present essentially what they were doing, and you got to know people a little bit better, even though you'd not met them in real life.
Yeah.
Got some more questions coming in here. How do you align your company's culture value? Wait, let me rethink this, how to approach this. So if you have talent, if you've got people coming from prior work experiences where maybe there was a really strong culture that got ingrained with them, or they have a really strong personality and values, how do you align them with your own company's culture if they've already got this really strongly formed one that they're bringing in?
I think I can see a positive and a negative side to that question. Ideally, this person's, when this instance happens, this person is coming to join your organization because they've already felt and touched into like what your culture is, and you've named some of that. This is almost every interview I've been a part of. Someone says like, "What's the culture like here?" And you should be able to name that, and they should experience that through the interview process. So hopefully, even if they've come from a strong culture, I'm hoping they come in with a higher standard for what is good enough, and like they're actually being more selective, and so they may put you under more kind of like right pressure to make sure that you've got some of this set up. The hard side of this is if they've come from a place and they have strong viewpoints but that don't align with yours, then I don't think your job is to align them with your culture. I think your job is to disqualify them in an interview process and say like, this isn't the right person. There are tons of high potential, like really effective humans out there that would be a disaster in many of the companies that I've led, and that's okay. Not every place needs to be for everyone. There's our company really valued openness and honesty, and there's some people who like to keep things a lot more closer to the vest, and that's okay. And they might not be as good of a fit there. There are definitely some, I mean, a common value I see is like a no assholes rule or something like that. Like there are some people out there who are real jerks that perform extremely well in some companies and they won't do well in other places. So I don't think your job is to align them. I do think you have to be clear on what you stand for so that they can make a choice and you can make a choice on, are we a good fit together? I do think the idea of culture fit is tricky because I think there is a way of like, you are living into this over time. I don't think it's just to like, I like this, and therefore we're a fit. So there's nuance there, but hopefully you should feel like this is a place that's going to bring the best out of you, and you're going to bring the best out of us, and we're going to build this place together.
So Sean has a question. He says, what is most important in holding an in-person hackathon for your team? In your experience, how do you hold the best possible hackathon for a team, and what does a great outcome look like? I guess that also relates to if you are having everybody on site What should you try to accomplish with that sort of experience?
Sure. I don't know if I've run a hackathon before, but I'll ask a couple questions probably for you, Sean. So I think the first one is like, what is the goal of the hackathon? Like, how did this come to be? Maybe it's that big bear. So like, how did this come to be? Is the goal to produce new outcomes or new output that's going to be new products to carry forward? Like, you trying to create something, or are you just trying to like do something where you're exploring and everyone can get a sense of how it is to be in other people's shoes? I happen to know some of Sean's team, so I know you have some engineers and you have some marketers, and so as part of it to like understand each other's worlds a little more. But like your goals, like what you want to have accomplished, and that should drive some of the outcomes or drive some of the design of how you structure that. And then, yeah, if the hackathon is a chance to all be together in the same place, I'd kind of steer back toward like, what are the core values that you have, or what's in your culture code? I think you were one of the ones that raised your hand as having this articulated. And I'd look at like, how can we amplify these at the hackathon? How can we really make them happen without knowing exactly what they are? It's a little hard to know how to dial them up, but this feels like a chance for your culture to be on display. And so I would lean into that.
We've got another question. How can you distinguish operational pivots from mission drift? Some organizations like OpenAI have pivoted and changed their corporate structure, and they've been successful, but also drawn criticism.
I need to think about this one. Some of these are phrases operational pivots from mission drift. John, I might need more context on what you mean by that. Maybe a rephrase on when you say mission drift. I'm guessing that means like they start to move, like drifting away from their mission and going to do some other thing. I do think the most effective cultures start in a place of like, we're clear on who we are and what ways we behave together, that is almost completely separate from what the business actually does. Most people don't. Slack, as an example, Slack began as a game called Tiny Spark. It was a game that you could live in this immersive world and jump around. And then at some point they're like, this game's not really taking off. And as they built that game, what they built is a communication tool internally. That was how they talked. And so they're like, this tool's cool, let's build this instead. And that's how Slack became Slack, which is a complete operational pivot from being a game company to, moving toward enterprise software eventually. But I don't think it changed anything of what they were up to. Even, and I don't know this specifically, but I do believe even mission was true, because a lot of it was like, how do you connect humans in like a digital world? Like the game was about play with other people. It was less like outcome driven. It was about how do we interact. And so I guess that's the example that comes to mind, John, with that is like, I think a lot of times like what you're up to, why you exist, and how you behave is pretty solid, if not like a truth. And then the pivots can still exist on top of that in an ideal world. I don't know if that's always the case, but even then, if it's the pivots coming at a risk of your values, the things that are important, then you should be having a very different conversation to make sure that the business serves you and serves the kind of person that you want to be. OpenAI was nonprofit, became a for-profit with limitations. Got it. Okay. If there's a follow-up there, feel free to ask too.
Todd, what are some other mistakes you see founders make with regard to culture that maybe you haven't touched on?
I think I touched on it briefly, but the biggest one is the need or the belief that I need to get this right and perfect. And I just see founders like overly like feeling like they need to wordsmith things and have this be like delivered and have it be like everything needs to go well, and any feedback of anything about our culture being bad is like kind of comes at a personal cost. And I just think there's a different way. Like to me, so much of what stitches us together as humans is the conversation. And so if you can just stay clipped into the conversation of how are these things that we've said are important to us, are we actually living them? How is that going? How is this for you? How is this for your team? How is this working for us as an organization? And really being in a place of like, we're learning our way there. You as the founder or the leader are leading that effort. And so you do need to keep leading. You do need to keep moving in action and like identify like what direction you're headed. That is your role. But your role is not to assure the outcome. Your role is not to like suddenly leap to some new place and like make things perfect or happen. I'd say, yeah, this is a chance to exemplify being a learning organization. and like how you do this.
What advice do you have for founders that feel like they are on the brink of burnout, but they also have they feel an immense amount of pressure to continue leading by example and not let their team down?
Oh, one of my favorite authors, Parker Palmer, once named that in his mind, burnout was really about being asked to give things that aren't yours to give. And that is always stuck in my head. And so when I hear any founder talk about burnout, I think about what are you giving that you feel like you can't give anymore? And usually it's not just pure time. Usually there's some activities or some things that are taking all of my energy. And as my energy is draining, my hope is draining. And I look at those activities and I think, can you bring a partner alongside you in some way? This is one of the reasons I am a coach today, is to like be that partner. Sometimes it's a mentor, sometimes it's a friend, sometimes that can be a therapist. And I think also this sometimes founders miss the key hire, the hire that most takes the thing that is draining them off of their plate. Like we're kind of in this mode of like, hire the next engineer, hire the next marketer. And a lot of times it's an executive assistant, a COO, like somebody else that can come in and take some of the work that is just like such a grind for you and that can be a delight for them. That's a very simplistic answer. And I do think like behind your question, Sean, is like a whole bunch of depth that I'm curious about. And yeah, I'll leave it there. If a conversation on that would be helpful, I'm happy to chat though.
All right. Another, not quite a question, but a previous company, we had employees choose a customer and present to the team at our monthly company lunch. The entire team voted on the best presentation. The winning company received a prize. Oh, that's a cool. I love culture.
Anthony, even hearing that and that you're wanting to share that, I think there's like this idea of giving in there. Like there's something like giving that seems really important. There's something about being able to like see how other people think about what charities might be most meaningful and voting on them. Like I'm guessing maybe there's a presentation, like that's like a beautiful story of a culture and some things that are important to you on display.
Todd, I have one other question, and then I think we might need to wrap up.
Yep.
In terms of, culture when things are going great, when you're raising money and you're adding folks, can you talk a little bit about the role culture plays when things are difficult? If you have to lay folks off, if there's, something not going well with the business.
Yeah, so certainly when things aren't going well, this is a time when there's a good chance for more of the skepticism. I think as leaders, we can sometimes start to break down and start to live in ways that are a little more, I think of it like kind of below the line, and start to be a little more in a command and control mode. And if the culture that you're aiming to build truly does bring out the best in you, it's an opportunity to lean into that even more. One of the companies that my past companies, at one point we had a layoff, and one of our core values is that we care for people, and we did our very best to care for people in that moment. Do we do the greatest job? I'm sure not. But it was presenced in the conversation. It was why we stayed up super late planning things and trying to orchestrate things in a meaningful way. And we checked back in on it afterwards, and we did our best to help those people kind of like find the next place for them. It's a time when, if anything, like your values are even more on display and can be a source of strength. If you are below the line, though, this is also a place where they can become like a real place of skepticism. And so I think it's like, yeah, it's an amplifying moment in those times.
Thank you. Well, everyone, so glad you could join us today. Todd, thank you so much for sharing your experience and all of your knowledge with us. Todd has generously offered to give anyone attending a free copy of his book. And so you've got information there, how to contact him for the format that you would prefer. And Todd, you also want to add the second piece that you're asking for?
Yeah, one of the things I value is feedback and my own learning. So if you have any feedback for me and are willing to share it when you email me, I'd love anything that was confusing, useful, or boring. And I especially like the confusing or boring because they tend to help me like get better. So if there's anything that you want to share, feel free to bring that. You will not hurt my feelings. You will help me, and you will help me live in a way that's important for me to live. So, but yes, do email me at that email address and let me know if you prefer a Kindle or PDF copy, and I will get that over to you. And then I
Excellent.
believe some next steps too, Brittain.
Yes, so, and we, as I mentioned at the beginning, we will get this up on the Mucker blog here shortly. And you can get, if you have any additional questions or if you have other ideas for future sessions, you can reach out to me. My email is right there. Our next Mucker Growth webinar is coming up on May 24th. We're going to be digging into some tactical work with SEO backlinks. So hope you'll put that on your calendar and join us for that. And again, thank you so much for being part of this today.
Thanks, y'all.